I really wasn't sure what I wanted to major in, but someone told me that if you had a degree in math, you could get better jobs. Now, the way I was taught math, I couldn't imagine that anyone would ever pay money to have me do math. But I thought, okay, I believe these people, so I'll major in math. So that's what I did.
Let's go back to your time at Stanford at SOL, because that was a very exciting time for research.
The big announcement of Karmarkar was November '84. In the middle of '85, we were working on it and showed that we'd done a lot of numerical tests to show that you could implement a Newton barrier method, as we called it, and run it on a lot of linear programs, and that there was a mathematical equivalence, that you could interpret Karmarkar's method as a barrier method with a certain choice of the barrier parameter. And I got to give a talk at the math programming meeting in 1985 about this equivalence. So there was a funny thing that happened. I gave my talk. We're mathematicians, right? So I said, we have this result where if you choose the barrier parameter this way, the steps are the same. And afterwards, this person came running up to me and he said, this is terrible, this is terrible, this is wrong. I said, it's a theorem, it's true. And he said, I don't care, it's terrible. And I thought, well, he may not like it, but it's true. A theorem is true. It's interesting in mathematics often, especially in algorithms, I think, where something comes along later. It seems like a new idea, but if you look at it the right way, it's the same thing that was done before, possibly with a different notation and a different motivation. So it depends on, the application, but I think the individual mathematical excitement is more sort of I've solved that puzzle, I've tied this knot, I've done this and that. Getting the code to work is great because you think, yes, it's actually working, and then seeing the real world thing is just very exciting. Mathematics is running into all these areas that was not important in before and being used in new ways. And this brings new insights. I mean, I think that's the great thing about what research can do is you have a way, you look at it a certain way, someone comes in from a different area with a different perspective, and it just opens it up.
And how about if we ask the same question, but not in relation to advances in research, but in relation to advances in society, say the role of women, minorities?
So I think women have advanced a lot, but there's a long way to go. And talking to women students at Korat, I can tell that they're not always getting the encouragement to do things that the male students are. Or they're put off by aspects of the profession, math or computer science, that I don't fully understand. Sometimes people will ask me about being a woman, and I'll say, well, it wasn't so nice when people would make these pretty nasty comments to me about being a woman and how you're inferior. And they say, well, that should challenge you, that should make you want to succeed. And it's true that if someone says to you, you're no good, you think, yes, I am. But not everybody reacts that way. Some people say, you say I'm no good, I don't want to be around you. I don't want to be here in this group. So it's not the case that everybody reacts well to criticism.
So Margaret, tell me about your early life in California. I believe you were born in San Francisco, is that right?
I was born in San Francisco and lived there 3 days because my mother was a medical doctor and had interned in San Francisco and wanted me to be born at a hospital there. But as soon as we could leave, we went back to Hanford, California, which is in the Central Valley. It's a small town of about 10,000 people.
How far from San Francisco is it?
Oh, it's probably 300 miles, something like that.
And then did you have most of your schooling there?
I lived there till I was 10. I went to elementary school there. One of the things that happened to me, which would never happen now, is that because I did better academically than the other kids in my class, I was skipped a grade. They don't do that anymore because it has a tendency to create people with psychological problems. But they didn't know that then. So
do you feel that happened to you?
I don't judge that myself. But that's what made me slightly younger than the other
There
kids.
could be some advantages as well as disadvantages.
Yes,
right?
but they don't do it anymore. It's
know.
quite interesting. They don't let people skip. They used to. Anyway, and when I was 10, we moved to Tucson, Arizona. One of my brothers had a health problem and the climate there was better, so I went to junior high and high school in Tucson. And then returned to California to go to Stanford as an undergraduate.
Let's go back to your earlier schooling. So when would you say you developed an interest in mathematics? Was it early on? Was that your favorite subject?
It was not my favorite subject. I liked all of school. I was a school wimp. You know, one of those kids that people say, oh, I hate school, I wish summer were here. And I would say, no, I love school. I mean, really a dork in some sense, but you know, that's the way I was. And so I always did well in math, but math is so elementary at that stage in your life, it's hard to tell. Even in high school, I always was the best student in math. But that's not saying a lot. It's just saying that that's the way it was. So I was always interested in it, but no one in my family had been an academic. I had no idea about getting a PhD or anything like that. I just knew that I liked math, among other subjects.
Can you tell us something about your parents?
Both my mom and dad were medical doctors. They had both gone to the University of California. I only realized much later how exceptional it was that my mother had been in medical school in the 30s. There were hardly any women
Was
then.
it UCSF then? too?
UCSF, right? Exactly. And my mother did, it's a specialty they don't have anymore, eye, ear, nose, and throat. And my dad was a general practitioner.
And they met in medical school?
Yes, they did. And, you know, they both kind of wished I would become a doctor, medical doctor, which of course meant that I didn't want to do that.
I see.
I wanted to do something else. So I would call it a pretty mild form of rebellion, but I sort of said, I don't want to be a doctor like you.
And were you the oldest sibling?
I was. I had two brothers, younger than I.
mean,
one,
yeah, how much
one
difference?
almost 3 years younger, and the other one 3 years younger than that. So
And so then, was it obvious to you from a certain point in high school that you would be going to college somewhere?
I think it's one of those instances where there was never even a question about it. Both my parents were medical doctors. Everyone in their families had gone to college. It was just not even thought about that I wouldn't go to college.
And did you early on think about Stanford?
Well, again, it's a little mild rebellion story. So both my parents had gone to Berkeley and then to UCSF. So there was a certain amount of course, you're going to go to UC Berkeley. And because we lived in Arizona, I thought maybe I would have to pay out-of-state tuition. But it turned out if your parents are alums, you don't have to. So being rebellious, I wanted to go to school in the West Coast region. And so I said, I think I'll apply to Stanford, which caused a certain amount of consternation because, you know, Stanford and Berkeley are historical rivals, but they said that's fine. I got into both of them and I decided to go to Stanford.
And you didn't apply anywhere else?
No. Overconfident. No, it's not true. I applied to the University of Arizona, but since 80%
Your
of
safe school.
high school graduates in Arizona got in there, that was not a tough
Well,
one.
times were different then. from now.
Absolutely.
And tell us about your first days at Stanford.
My first week at Stanford, I had two roommates who were very sociable, very sociable. There were three girls, as we then were called, in a room. And they were saying, you know, why did I come to Stanford? And I said, because of the intellectual stimulation, really, what a prig. I said, I'm really looking forward to this great sort of intellectual environment. And they burst out laughing, and they both said, we came here to meet boys. What's wrong with you? And I said, oh, okay. So they were very nice, but we had slightly different perspectives. But I loved Stanford. I thought it was, you know, a great environment. There were plenty of interesting classes. I liked all my subjects. And the hard decision that I had was what to major in, because I liked math, I liked English, I liked history, I liked French.
And there was no computer science
No
undergraduate
computer science
major, at least.
undergraduate degree
Maybe
at the
not
time.
even a department then.
There was no
It
department.
started soon after, I think.
Right. So
You
I
were
just,
at college in which years?
60 to 64.
Yeah, I think this department started in 1965, I think.
Correct. I got a master's degree in 65, which was the first year they gave that degree.
Master's in computer science?
Right.
Oh. So what were some of the other majors you were thinking about?
Well, I took a lot of English classes and French and history, and math, of course. Math was the most demanding of the majors. You had to take the most classes in it. And I really wasn't sure what I wanted to major in, but someone told me that if you had a degree in math, you could get better jobs. Now, the way I was taught math, I couldn't imagine that anyone would ever pay money to have me do math. But I thought, okay, I believe these people, so I'll major in math. So that's what I did. So it wasn't a decision based on loving that subject more than others. It was a sort of practical decision about what would give me a job. And of course, it was right.
Can you tell us about any of the professors there in mathematics? Was Schiffer there then?
I didn't have Schiffer. George Sago was there, and what a wonderful man he was.
Oh,
I
tell us
took
about that.
orthogonal polynomials
Oh, wow.
from him.
Amazing.
And
That was a whole course?
a whole course, yes.
Wow, I didn't know that.
And I think number theory also from him. And he was one of the sweetest people you can imagine, and went through everything very carefully. And I didn't appreciate it fully at the time. I knew he was a famous person, but I didn't tend to think I'm in the presence of greatness, which I was. But I thought it was really great. I loved my math courses, I really did. And you know, as I say, I never figured out at that time why I could get a job with that degree.
Was Polya there too?
He was there, but I didn't have a class from him. He was around, and he was an amazing man, as we all know. He gave a lecture once, this is later, when I was a computer science student, where he talked about conveying the excitement of mathematics. I think he was close to 90. And he was on the stage expostulating, waving his arms, saying, if you don't know the answer, guess, you should guess. And then he kind of leaped off the stage in this wild gesture, and everybody went, thinking, you know, he's going to topple over, but he didn't. And he was wonderful, and that was quite inspiring.
Any other professors you remember from your undergraduate
Well,
years?
actually, I took computer programming from Gene Golub.
Really?
When I was an undergraduate. They were just starting to offer that course at Stanford, and I really loved that. I thought it was so great that you could make computers do things that you wanted to do. And Gene was on the mathematical side of computer science, and the homeworks that he assigned were, you know, pretty much mathematical problems,
And
which
this would
I
be
thought were great.
Using Fortran, I guess?
There was a language called Balgol, which was Burroughs' Algol. Burroughs' computer was at Stanford at the time, so I never learned Fortran. I only used Algol.
Well, you learned it later.
I learned it later, of course, but I didn't know it at the time, and I liked that a lot. And so when I was about to finish my bachelor's degree, I decided, okay, I have to get a master's degree because I want to get a job, and they were just starting the computer science department. So I decided to get a master's in computer science.
So was Knuth there then?
He had just come.
Did you take a class from
No,
him?
I did not.
What about Forsyth?
Forsyth was there. I took numerical analysis from him, and I also took numerical analysis from Cleve Mulder,
Oh, really?
who was just finishing his PhD in math, I think.
So tell us about these famous people, Gene, George, and Cleve, back when they were young.
Well, I mean, they were all good teachers. They were all enthusiastic, especially Cleve, I have to say, who was, you know, full of energy about matrix computation and numerical analysis and so
Was
on.
he still a graduate student at that point?
I think he might have been. I'm not absolutely.
He got his PhD with Forsyth.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
And Gene was a young assistant professor.
Gene was a young assistant professor who had come in, and Forsyth had been there for a long time, and he became the first chair of the computer science department.
And what was he like? I never met him.
He was more reserved, but absolutely full of integrity, and everyone respected him and thought his classes were great. I mean, I wish now that I'd been more observant at the time. You know, as I said, it's sort of like thinking, this is George Sago, he's a great man, I should pay more attention to him. But I didn't. They were all good teachers.
Well, at least you remember them.
Well, of course I remember them. They were all really good teachers. So that's what I remember. Well, so I got my master's degree and I got a job doing scientific programming at Sylvania
In the Bay Area?
in the Bay Area, which was in Mountain View. And it was somewhat interesting because I went for a job interview and they said, you know, you have this master's from Stanford in computer science. Do you know how to program in Fortran? And I said, no. And I made what probably seemed like a really obnoxious comment. I said, but I was taught that, you know, if I have the basics of programming, I'll be able to learn a new language. And they sort of went, well, we don't know if that's true. We don't know if you're going to be able to learn Fortran, but the man that ended up hiring me seemed to accept that.
And of course it was
I
true.
did learn Fortran, yes, pretty fast, actually. And an interesting thing that I hope does not exist anymore, but there was explicit and legal discrimination against women at that time. So I had a master's degree from Stanford in computer science. There were two men in the same group that I was in at Sylvania who had Associate of Arts degrees, that's a 2-year degree, from junior colleges. Their salaries were 30 to 40% higher than mine.
Do you remember what yours was?
I think it was $9,000 a year, which was pretty good. It was pretty
bad,
good, but
yeah.
theirs was higher. And I asked about this, and they said, "Well, you're a woman, and you know it's not as important for you to have a high salary." And it was legal to do that then. The laws.
For how long?
I don't remember when the amendment came in. I mean, you probably know the story. This was an amendment. They were trying to pass a Civil Rights Act against discrimination, and one of the Southern senators, Stennis, maybe, put in an amendment forbidding discrimination against women, which everyone thought would kill the bill, but it actually passed. And people were horrified because they used to advertise jobs for women, which were usually not technical jobs, and that made it illegal. I think it was when Johnson had first been elected as president. Kennedy was killed in '63. Johnson was elected in
64. So it was the
'64. I think it
60s.
was his first term.
Yeah, I think I might be right. Okay, so what was it like working at Sylvania?
Well, I don't think I was as annoyed as I should have been, first of all. So here's what I say when I talk to young people now about doing things. I say, I learned an incredible amount at that job, but it was mostly about what we might call the real world. I learned about how things operated. I learned about teams that had to put something together. I learned about how you have a project to do and you have to get it done, and you may not have time to do the absolute perfect thing that you want to do because you have to get it done. And that was my first exposure to optimization. So there's a famous paper that you know well by Fletcher and Powell, which appeared in 62 or 63. 63, and we were doing unconstrained optimization, and I read that paper, and I implemented the Fletcher-Powell, DFP as we now call
With
it,
an exact line?
quasi-Newton method with an accurate line search, yes, in Fortran. And we used that, and
And did
I
it
thought
work?
this is so interesting. Yes, it worked really well.
10 or 20 variables, something like that?
Probably fewer than that, maybe 6 or 7, but that's all we needed.
Right. And what was their business?
GTE Sylvania made, it was a lot military, not weaponry, but electronic devices, so detecting things and measuring things and so on and so forth. So they were doing a lot of simulations and using these techniques in that. So another thing I worked on, which is very funny in retrospect, was with a person who was doing automatic ship photo interpretation. So they had pictures of ships and they wanted to identify them. And we developed a method based on linear programming, which I had not learned about as a graduate student, but I learned about it from working on this problem, from reading papers, about what is linear programming and so on. I think Danzig's book is 63, so I probably read Danzig's book. And during that time, you haven't asked me this, but I became convinced that if I didn't get an advanced degree, namely a PhD, I would never get anywhere. I mean, I was enjoying myself. Sylvania had a program where I could go to Stanford and take graduate classes if I wanted to, but I thought, you know, I don't want to, I liked the fact that other people had power over what they did, and I didn't. I really worked on what I was assigned to work on.
So how long were you there in total?
I went back to graduate school in 71, so I was there 6 years.
That's quite a while.
Yes, yes, and it was a very valuable experience. I mean, people say must have been such a waste of your time. It wasn't a waste of my time. But it's not as though I made huge technical advances.
But you have a daughter. Was that during that time?
She was born in 68, so I worked part-time for a while after she was born. But they were great about that too. I mean, I have nothing bad to say about my experience there, except for we're paying these men a lot more than you. But that was the way it was. When I was thinking of going back to get my PhD, I thought I'd really like to go back to Stanford because I had been taking classes in, and I phoned up whoever was the person in charge of the PhD program and said,
In computer science?
In computer science, and I said I have my master's and I'd like to apply to the PhD program. What do I do? And he said, oh, we have a policy that if you've been admitted to the master's program earlier, you can just come to the PhD program.
Really?
Yes.
But with support?
They changed that later.
With support or without support?
Yes, with support.
Amazing.
I mean, I was stunned that they did that. In fact, people now tell me I must have made this up, but I didn't make it up. And so I said, well, that's great. So I said, I don't have to do anything. He said, oh, you have to write me a letter saying you want to come back as a graduate student. And that's fine. So that's what I did. So now people say things to me like, what were your GRE scores? I didn't take the GREs. I really didn't do anything except show up. So I went back in 71, joined the numerical analysis group that was run at that time by Forsyth and Golub, and was interested in optimization.
And then Forsyth died in 72?
Yes, he became ill the first year that I was there.
So it must have been a terrible time.
It was a terrible time. He went downhill very fast and died, but you know, I was working on a directed reading course with him, and that was a lot of fun. I mean, I went in to see him once a week, and we talked about applied math and how to do various kinds of things and so on. I mean, he was a wonderful man. It was a real loss, and he was relatively young. He seemed old to me.
Much younger than we are now.
Yes,
probably.
exactly. That's right. That's right. And that's when I met his wife, Sandra.
And so did Gene Golub essentially take over running of that group?
He did. He did take over, and that's when the famous Sarah House group was started. There was a small house called Sarah House, which contained the AI group, part of the AI group, artificial intelligence, and the numerical analysis group, and we were all there. And Gene Golub assembled, you know, a group of students and had a constant stream of visitors. He was unbelievably active in getting people to come. And that's how I was fortunate enough to meet so many famous people who came to Stanford to give talks in the numerical analysis seminar.
Right.
So.
Yeah, I had the same experience just slightly later.
Right.
And now when I arrived at Stanford in 74, you weren't there because you had gone off to England to work with Walter Murray and Philip Gill. Is that right?
Right. So I believe the timing is this. Philip Gill, who worked at the National Physical Laboratory in England, in Teddington, visited Stanford. That's another thing Gene Golub did, is he always was having people visit. So Philip came to Stanford and visited for a semester, I think, and I met him then, and he worked on optimization. I think he was still working on his PhD, actually.
Yeah,
I don't think he had it then.
Yeah.
So he and I got to be friends, and then Walter Murray came the next year and taught a class. Now, I would think it's fair to say that there was a culture shock between Walter's idea of what an undergraduate math class was and Stanford students' idea of what an undergraduate math class was, because in England, when you are an undergraduate in mathematics, it means you've had intense training in mathematics already, and you're very good at it. The numerical analysis class at Stanford was open to all undergraduates. Many people who took it didn't have a clue about math, and they were appalled when Walter started rattling off proofs and doing things that were way too hard for them.
And were you a TA?
I was his TA. And let me just say, it was a situation that called for a certain amount of diplomacy, where I would try to say to him, your lectures are too hard. And he would say, no, they're not. What do you mean, too hard? This is easy. And I'd say, well, it's easy for you, but It's not easy for
But
the
he was only
students.
there for one semester at this
He
time?
was there for a
or
whole
one
year,
quarter?
I
It was a
think.
quarter system, I guess.
Yeah, I think he was there the whole year, but I'm not positive. But he only taught this one class that was undergraduate. He taught a graduate class.
And did Don Goldfarb come out about that time? I know he visited Stanford
I
around about
probably
then.
met him then. I don't remember vividly. Anyway, I won the Forsyth Award for help with education for being that TA because I tried to have a lot of office hours to help the students who were struggling. Well, Walter and I got along perfectly well. He knew I was interested in optimization. He said, "Can you come to the National Physical Lab and work with Philip and me?" And I spoke to Jean, who was wonderful, and said, "You know, if you go to England and work at the National Physical Lab, I'll pay you as an RA." He checked to make sure that was legal. It was. So I thought this will be great. You know, I had been to England earlier. I thought it would be a lot of fun, and it was. So I went to NPL for 7 months.
Tell us about NPL and Jim
Oh.
Wilkinson in particular.
NPL, at that time, sadly it's not the case anymore, was a really powerful and important research lab. Jim Wilkinson was probably the most famous person there, but there were other eminent numerical analysts. It was a government lab where they concentrated on research. They didn't have to have projects, they didn't have to be tied to anything particular. And the atmosphere was very stimulating. Not quite as lively as Bell Labs for me later, but it was very good. So I was there for 7 months. I got to work on my research with Walter. I got to learn all about English customs like the tea club, where they would sit every day and have tea at 11 o'clock and learn to speak some English expressions and so on. People were wonderfully hospitable, especially the Wilkinsons. So my husband and I were invited to dinner constantly, it seemed like, and it was really wonderful. I had been told that the English would not be friendly, that they were very reserved, and that just wasn't true at all.
I think you describe yourself as an Anglophile now.
Yes.
And is that when it began, really?
I think so.
Was that your first trip to England?
No, I had been to England earlier. So my husband had a Fulbright between 68 and 69. So when my daughter was born in 68, we went to England when she was 6 weeks old, and we were there for a year.
Was that when you stayed at Cliveden?
No, that's when I lived in Finchley, Margaret Thatcher's hometown.
So you were there for a whole year.
We were there for a whole year.
And so you were on leave from Sylvania, or you were working for
I
them
was on
remotely?
leave from Sylvania, and I took a job. My husband was doing research on the English class, the class actions in England, and I got a part-time job programming at the London School of Economics, which I really enjoyed, but there's a slightly funny thing about what happened. So soon after I began that job, I was doing Fortran programming. The students at LSE went on strike for something, I forget what it was, and they were on strike a long time, and I thought, oh, this is kind of disappointing. I won't be able to do this work, I won't get paid or whatever. And at the end of the time, they said, oh, by the way, you're getting paid for all those months that they were on strike. And I said, what? But I wasn't working. They said, no, it's the policy that you get paid for your time when we're on strike. So I said, okay. I didn't argue about that.
But you weren't part of the...
No, I mean, I said, I'm not in the union. I'm not doing anything. They said, that's all right, fine. When I was at Teddington at the NPL, you know, I had a wonderful time there and got lots done on my thesis, and then went back to Stanford.
And that's when I met you. I
Right.
met you more or less on the day of your thesis defense, I think.
Right.
And I came to that. It was a very interesting talk, and of course, I guess I wasn't at the closed session where they might have grilled you, but I don't know if they did.
No, it wasn't that hard.
Yeah. Because Walter and Phil weren't there, right? It would have been Jean and perhaps Joe Oliger and...
Richard Tapia was visiting at the time,
that's
and
right,
he
yeah.
was there. And then at Stanford, they always have a person who's not in your area. I've actually forgotten who that was.
So then you graduated, and then what?
One of the things that happened when I was a PhD student is my tendency to activism came to the fore. So there were a few things that some of us PhD students in the department, computer science department, didn't really like very much. So we got together, a small group, and we had a meeting of the graduate students, and we wrote down some of the things that we wanted to do. And one of the things we wanted to do was have course evaluations, because some of the courses were fine, but some were truly dreadful. Faculty didn't prepare, didn't care, or whatever. So we formed the course evaluation committee, 3 of us, and we went around and we made up a questionnaire, and we got permission to hand out the questionnaire, and we collected all the results, and we assembled them, and we wrote commentary about them, and we published a book. See, now you could do it on the web, but then we published the course evaluation booklet every semester. And some of the faculty had been very doubtful about doing this, but after we did it, they thought it was a great idea.
Probably not everybody, right?
Well, okay, but I mean, in general, it was considered to be a good idea.
Were you doing this with Bob Sedgwick?
I did it first with Randy Davis and Mike Clancy, and then with Bob Sedgwick. So I was the student bureaucrat, as they were called. So we elected
Two of you at a time?
2 of us at a time. And we got to go to faculty meetings, and we would joke about our strongly worded memos. That's when I first learned to write a strongly worded memo. So we would write these, of course, totally respectful, but
skill
firm.
that's come in very useful.
That's a skill that has come in handy later in my life. I think the department appreciated it. You know, in fact, they started asking us to do more things. They'd sort of say, oh, we can have the students do that. And I think it was very valuable, and I think it helped the department to have that tradition of activism. When I finished my PhD, Michael Saunders, who had been a colleague in the computer science department, he got his PhD in '72, I think, and then he went back to New Zealand, was going to come back to Stanford. And there was a group in the Operations Research Department, which George Dantzig ran, called Systems Optimization Lab. And they wanted to hire people to do research. And I wanted to stay at Stanford, partly for family reasons. And so they said, well, would I like to have a research associate position in that department? Now, people say to me now, you should never have done that. That was a terrible move. It's an inferior job. Why did you do it? Well, I did it. So I went to work in the Operations Research Department in this so-called Systems Optimization Lab, where there was no lab and there was really hardly anybody. It was just George Dantzig. And then Philip and Walter were not happy at the National Physical Lab, so we arranged to get some money to pay them, and they came, and then Michael came back from New Zealand.
Right, the famous gang of 4.
The famous gang of 4, Gill, Murray, Saunders, and Wright. So we were all in the Operations Research Department working on optimization with George Dantzig as the person in charge. And I did that from '76 to '88. Okay. Let me first say a word about George Dantzig.
I was just going to say.
One of the great sweethearts of all time. You knew him, right? I mean, he was a great man and totally modest and low-key. People used to come to the department and say, I want to meet the famous Professor Dantzig. And sometimes he would hide in his office and he would say, I don't want to meet them. I can't do this today. Be the famous Professor Dantzig. And so I learned so much from watching him be extremely effective. People used to joke that he's putting on an act. He's pretending to be a sweet man, but he's really manipulative. I never believed that, but he certainly got a lot done, acting like a sweet person. I think he was a sweet person. But he was a giant figure, and you know, I'm so thrilled that I was able to work with him and actually call him George. It took me years to work up to that. I kept calling him Professor Dantzig, and one day he said, why are you doing this? Why don't you call me George? And I said, all right, George.
But you also called him GBD.
That was behind his back. That was behind his back. That was the nickname, affectionate nickname we had for him. He was great, but you know, he had a certain view of linear programming. He wasn't so interested in nonlinear optimization, which is what the rest of us, except for Michael, tended to do, but he was very supportive. He didn't care. He helped us in every possible way. So I can't imagine a better person to run a lab.
And you must have got to know Dick Cottle then, too.
Yes, Dick Cottle was also in the Operations Research Department, a very low-key but wonderful man. So there were a lot of famous people in the Operations Research Department as well. A big difference, however, and I've just talked about computer science and the students participate in everything. In the OR department, students didn't participate in anything. They were not asked to do anything, they were not part of anything. And one of the faculty members there once came to me and said, "Margaret, I hear you're the Che Guevara of the computer science department." I thought, what? And he said, "Could you do that here?" And I said, what do you mean?
One of the students came to
No,
Or one of the
Vashek
faculty?
Chvatal.
Oh, Vashek.
Yes, and he said, "Could you be the Che Guevara here?" And I said, "I don't think so," because the faculty just, they had no concept of this being possible.
Well, why couldn't he do it?
He was about to leave. I think he then, and also he was only half in OR. He
was half in computer
half in
science.
CS and OR.
Yeah, he was a character, or he is a character.
Right. So another thing that I did, I'll just mention, is I had wanted to teach. So after I got my PhD, they needed someone in computer science to teach the elementary numerical analysis course, which I did. And in fact, Marcia Berger was one of the students in that class. And I loved it. I thought that was great, you know, that I could present this material that I find very exciting.
Did you teach in OR too?
I taught a few OR classes, more advanced classes than
Did you teach
optimization.
linear programming, for instance?
No, I taught nonlinear optimization. There were other people that teach linear programming, such as George.
And who else do you remember from those days of the faculty in OR?
Well, it had the same property that CS did in a way, which is lots of famous people came to visit. So Herb Scarf from Yale was one of the people that came. Christos Papadimitriou actually had a 50% appointment in the OR department, so he was around a lot. It was a very lively place. I personally felt they should have had the students involved more. That was my one sort of concern about it.
It turned out it was a great job, but at the same time, it probably became increasingly frustrating, perhaps, that you weren't in a regular faculty position. Is that right?
Right. So other people have given harsher descriptions of my position than I have. A good friend of mine described it as a dead-end position, which I don't
Turned out not to be.
I know, but it might have seemed to be, because research scientists, research associates were not faculty members. They didn't have voting privileges, they didn't have tenure, and so on and so forth. So there were 4 of us. I was in some sense the most junior. I had the most recent PhD. Because I was a female, people frequently would say to me, "Are you the programmer?" And of course, I never knew what to say. If I just said, "How dare you ask me that?" it looked too defensive. If I said no, they may have thought I was making it up. And so in the mid-'80s, I kind of let it be known by talking to people that I might be interested in leaving, which was a wrench. It was a terrible wrench. But I sometimes think really important decisions usually are a wrench. You know, if you're leaving something to do something better, it's sometimes not easy. So I made it known that I was interested in leaving, and a number of people said, did I want to apply for jobs at their institution?
Including Bell Labs?
Including Bell Labs, including Wisconsin, including a few other places. And finally, I just thought, all right, I'll go to Bell Labs. I thought it would be different, and I was able to take a leave from Stanford, you know, hedge your bets, so I could go back if I wanted to. But really, practically immediately when I got to Bell Labs, I loved it and decided that it was the right choice, although if I'd gone to Wisconsin, that probably would have been fine also.
So let's go back to your time at Stanford at SOL, because that was a very exciting time for research.
It certainly was. So Philip, Walter, Michael, and I worked together as a team of 4, and it's always hard to describe to an outsider what's happening. People always say, well, who's really doing the work? as if the rest of you were kind of on the coattails of the person who's doing the work. We all did the work, but it varied depending on what we were working on. And I've tried hard to think how to describe this, because people say, what's it like working as part of a team? And I don't know how to describe it. We would talk to each other all the time. Usually there would be one or two things we were working on. Different people were working on different things. Philip Walter and I wrote a book, which we published in 1981. Michael was invited to join that, and he didn't want to, so that took quite a lot of time. That was writing things up, which is slightly different than doing the research.
Well, that was a very influential book, and do you have any idea how many copies it sold?
I don't,
It
actually.
was a lot, though, I think.
I think
it was used for graduate courses for years.
Right. It's 30 years old, and it's held up pretty well, I have to say. So the biggest excitement happened twice. Okay, so George Dantzig in 1947 invented the simplex method for linear programming. Linear programming, minimization of a linear function subject to linear constraints, which sounds simple, and many people didn't understand how important it was. An extremely important problem. And his algorithm was specially designed for linear programming.
The simplex method.
The simplex method. And it used very heavily the structure of an optimal solution of a linear program. And for years, starting in the 60s, so it was invented in 47, it was a big success in practice from the word go. But in the 60s, people started getting interested in computational complexity, people in computer science, and they wanted to know, if you have an algorithm, what's the worst case time it can take? So how much time can it take for a certain problem size? And the worry was that the simplex method, which follows the edges of a certain feasible region defined by linear constraints, could be very expensive. In 72, a famous example by Victor Klee, and I'm not sure Minty's first name, the Klee-Minty example showed that the simplex method, in the worst case, could take an exponential number of steps, which is what the complexity people had feared. So the wisdom is only a polynomial time algorithm can be good, can be fast. So it was a funny situation because the simplex method was used by practitioners all over the world, and they thought it was fast, and it was fast. Worst case could be exponential time, and this was unsatisfactory. So for a long time, people kept saying, is there a polynomial time algorithm for linear programming? And many people worked on this and were not able to get a solution. And the Klee-Minty example showed that the exponential bound was achievable. So in 1979, Kachin, a 28-year-old Soviet mathematician, published a paper which had a polynomial time linear programming algorithm in it. It was based on early work by Shor, Nemirovsky, and Udine, which was on nonlinear problems, but his was for linear programming. So it was very interesting. It was in the New York Times front page below the fold, so not super important. Soviet mathematician makes breakthrough in linear programming. And it was completely misrepresented. I mean, they said a Soviet mathematician has shown how to prove, that linear programs can be solved in polynomial time, but it basically implied that the Soviets, remember it was the Cold War, were going to crack all the US codes and break all our cryptography systems and cause havoc and wreck everything. So the phone in our department was ringing off the hook because all these reporters were calling George Dantzig and saying, what do you know about this? Is it true? Is the US open to attack by the Soviets now because of this math? Blah, blah, blah. It was very exciting. And it was a particularly funny experience I had was talking to a reporter for a pretty good publication, and he was saying, well, what does polynomial time mean? And I said, well, you know what a polynomial is? No. So I started saying, well, you have x and then you raise it to a power. And he said, doesn't it just mean it's really, really fast? And I said, no, it doesn't mean it's really, really fast. It means it has this certain form. And he said, thanks. I mean, he didn't want to know. His readers did not want to know what polynomial time. I think his story just said polynomial means fast. Anyway, our group, the four of us, decided to implement Kachin's method and try it on some linear programs. What we found was it was much slower than the simplex method. It was polynomial time, but the bound was huge. And it wasn't in any way a competitor to the simplex method, but it was polynomial time. And that's the big theoretical breakthrough. That was 79. So I was still at Stanford. So we'd been through the Kachin thing. In 84, front page of the New York Times, above the fold, breakthrough in linear programming. So it talked about Karmarkar and how he had produced a polynomial time linear programming algorithm that was 50 times faster than the simplex method. See, the problem with Kachin had been it's polynomial time, but it's not faster than the simplex method. So there was this new thing, and again, phones are ringing, is it faster, what's happening? And a problem was, because he worked at AT&T, it was stated that it was proprietary and he couldn't actually give any details about it. So it was slightly confusing because here's this algorithm, you can't tell what it is, it's 50 times faster than the simplex method and it's polynomial time.
Had it not been published at this point?
It had not been published, I don't think, fully yet. Remember, this is before the internet, before the web. Right. So Karmarkar came to visit Stanford. George Dantzig invited him, and he was giving a talk. And he was in the conference room, and he was putting some equations up of what he did, but very few. And the equations that he put up reminded me of some of the equations that had been in barrier function methods, which was the topic of my PhD thesis. Certain characteristic things with 1 over the constraint squared appearing in a diagonal matrix. Yeah, the derivative of the log barrier function. So the group talked about it. We said, you know, this kind of looks like a barrier function. Could what Karmarkar is doing be connected with barrier function methods? So that was in 85. So the big announcement of Karmarkar was November 84. In the middle of 85, we were working on it and showed that we'd done a lot of numerical tests to show that you could implement a Newton barrier method, as we called it, and run it on a lot of linear programs, and that there was a mathematical equivalence, that you could interpret Karmarkar's method as a barrier method with a certain choice of the barrier parameter. Mm-hmm. So Karmarkar did not think of it as a barrier function. I'm not sure he
called
knew.
It the projective method.
Right. I'm not sure he knew about barrier functions because they had fallen into disfavor. Right. People thought they weren't very efficient. Mm-hmm. So that was kind of exciting.
Absolutely.
And I got to give a talk at the math programming meeting in 1985 about this equivalence. Yeah.
And there was a fifth person involved in this too, wasn't there?
John Tomlin. Right, John Tomlin. So the paper we wrote is Gill, Murray, Saunders, Tomlin, and Wright. Right, because John Tomlin had been at the systems optimization lab before and was heavily involved in the testing. So there was a funny thing that happened. I gave my talk. We're mathematicians, right? So I said, we have this result where if you choose the barrier parameter this way, the steps are the same. And afterwards, this person came running up to me and he said, this is terrible, this is terrible, this is wrong. I said, it's a theorem, it's true. And he said, I don't care, it's terrible. And I thought, well, he may not like it, but it's true. A theorem is true. So that was that.
What did he mean?
I think he meant that it was really awful to kind of diminish the importance of Karmarkar's work by showing it was equivalent to something old, which is not at all what we intended to do. It's interesting in mathematics often, especially in algorithms, I think, where something comes along later. It seems like a new idea, but if you look at it the right way, it's the same thing that was done before, possibly with a different notation and a different motivation.
So what was Karmarkar's reaction?
I don't know. I mean, I wasn't working at Bell Labs at the time.
Right. Was he there when you moved?
Yes, he was there, but he was in the math center. I was in the computer science center.
So you didn't have much interaction?
I didn't have much interaction with him. He was working on trying to get special purpose hardware built and do lots of other interesting things. He's a brilliant guy, and in no way would I ever want to take away from his achievement. Mm-hmm. But I think there was suspicion, you know, that these barrier function people were trying to sort of muscle in on the new world of linear programming, which wasn't our intent.
Mm-hmm.
But it turns out, in retrospect, because AT&T took this view that it was proprietary and they couldn't tell anybody what it did, Newton's method's been around a long time. Barrier methods had been around a long time. This book by Fiacco and McCormick, which was published in '68, had been around for a long time, and all the equations were in there.
Right.
It's just you applied them to linear programming.
Yeah.
So, an interesting period in the history of linear programming.
So the four of you wrote a lot of papers together
We
at
did.
SOL. What were some of the other highlights?
Well, we wrote papers and we wrote software. So we all believed very much that we should prove theorems about what we did, and we should also write software. And so we wrote software together. And I mean, Michael, you are familiar with the fact that people have different styles in software. So writing a major piece of software was a big production, getting everybody to agree. And also, I think it's true that writing a program to do something is much harder than writing a paper about it. In the paper, you can say, there exists a positive constant such that this is true, and then you can prove something. When you're writing the program, you actually have to set the positive constant. You have to say what it is. Or you can say, the user can pick this positive constant, which they don't like. So all these details that you can sort of not pay attention to when you're writing a theoretical paper, you have to deal with when you're actually writing code. And you know, the other thing is, with floating point arithmetic, we're numerical analysts, so we think about finite precision. Lots of results that hold with exact arithmetic do not hold in finite precision. And you have to be aware of that when you're writing software.
So was NP-Sol the most influential piece of software that came out of that?
Probably. Nonlinear programming, SOL could sort of stand for Systems Optimization Lab or Solution. Right, exactly.
And then there was QP-Sol,
NP-Sol,
LU-Sol.
QP-Sol, LU-Sol.
And they were all interrelated, I think.
Right, right. LU-Sol was, I wasn't so involved in that. That was Michael Saunders. He's really the main linear algebra figure there, and that was his work. But even then, we all had something to contribute.
And did the other faculty at Stanford, Danzig in particular, and say Dick Cottle, did they take much interest in this software that you produced?
I don't think so. I think they were happy we were there. They were happy to have an enterprise that was working on software. George, in particular, had written a number of papers called something like On the Need for a Systems Optimization Laboratory. His idea was, and these went back to the 60s, I think, where he said we need a place where people can get together and talk about algorithms and implement them and actually solve big problems. He was very worried about huge problems that come up. He called them systems optimization, where you have big systems of complex parts that work together. And he wanted people to be able to solve those problems. That was his big interest in life, was solving those problems.
With integer variables? Was that a big thing for him too?
Not as much, but somewhat. I mean, George, we used to think, does George actually write software? See, I don't even know the answer to that. I tried to find that out. Did George Danzig himself sit down and write programs? And we think maybe he did, but he didn't talk about it much. But he knew exactly what they did. He knew how they worked. And you know, he made so many wise comments about, have you taken care of this case? Have you done this? Have you done that?
Who were the users for the software, and were you heavily involved with them? Did they give you a lot of feedback?
People who work on the algorithmic side of mathematics. So I've been on many committees where we talk about what is mathematics? What's the end result of mathematics? And some people will say theorems. You know, we prove that this result is true. Others say it's algorithms for solving problems based on theorems. I mean, you don't just make them up, but you want a way to solve a problem. And very seldom is that done by writing symbols on a piece of paper. There are symbolic software systems, such as Mathematica and Maple, that allow you to do symbolic computations, but an enormous amount of interest exists in numerical solution of problems. So when you're a numerical analyst, a die-hard numerical analyst, which I am and many people are, you produce algorithms, and then first of all you want to say, all right, I have proved that this algorithm is good, it has a good rate of convergence, it's accurate, whatever. I think I'd better try it. I'd better run it with some real numbers. So you do that, and maybe it works the way you thought, or maybe it doesn't work the way you thought. And then you say, well, now I've proved that this thing has to be negative, but actually it's not negative. So there's either a bug in your program, or you've run into a problem with floating point arithmetic, or the problem's ill-conditioned. So lots of notions about the condition of a problem and when is the computed solution accurate, when is the computed solution close to the solution of a nearby problem, all these things in error analysis and so on, which were pioneered by Jim Wilkinson, to a large extent become important.
And these were points that you made quite emphatically in the book, is that
Exactly. So when we were at Stanford, our group working on solving it, so let's say we thought of a method, NP-Sol, a sequential quadratic programming method for nonlinearly constrained optimization. So we have a theory, we prove it converges, we show that if you adjust things in a certain way, it will get to the solution. If you have the exact second derivatives, it'll converge quadratically. Well, that's fine. And you could stop there, and you could publish this. But of course, we weren't satisfied, so we said we'd better write some software to do this. So sometimes we'd start with a simple case for us. But if you write software, you rapidly discover that it's more complicated than you think initially, because you have to take care of all these cases. For example, let's suppose you have a problem where you have nonlinear constraints. And you say, let's assume a solution exists, a point exists satisfying these constraints. Then we can show such and such. Well, maybe someone will come along with constraints where there is no point that satisfies them. So do we just have it run forever till the person gives up, or do we say, well, we'd better have a test that if there's no feasible point, we'll do something sensible. What does sensible mean? And so on. So you gradually make it more and more complicated, and that's why when you have a conceptual algorithm, you can just sort of leave all those things out. Even deciding when an algorithm has converged correctly is a complicated problem. It depends on the scaling of the problem, the condition of the problem, the floating point arithmetic, and so on. And then once people hear that you have software, now we were working way in before the days of open source, they'd say, oh, I hear you have software that will solve this problem. Philip and Walter worked on a whole software library at the National Physical Lab before they came to Stanford as part of the numerical algorithms group library. So engineers, scientists, people that work want to solve their problems, and they don't want to write the software. They do not want to take the paper and write the code. So Philip and Walter had a long history of doing that. We continued that at Stanford. And then people hear about it, and this is even before the web or the internet, and they'll say, I hear you have a code that does this and that. Michael Saunders and Bruce Murtaugh wrote this famous code, Minos, which was for linearly constrained optimization. And they became extremely popular. But what happens, I'm smiling because it's so familiar, you put the software out and make it available. You don't necessarily make a profit, you just put it somewhere. And you put all these cautions, like only use this if there's a feasible point for the constraints, only use this if this is true and that's true. Well, people just ignore that. They just take the software, they run it, it doesn't solve their problem, and then they call you or send you an irate email. Your code doesn't work, it's garbage, what's wrong with you? And so you either get a very thick skin and ignore that, or you try to fix it. Maybe they've identified a problem. So you keep working on it, and that's why some people say writing software is never convergent, because you're always trying to make it better, and you're always trying to solve problems that came up. That's one of the reasons people have gone to open source, so that you find a bug in someone else's program, you can fix it.
And who were the users?
I would say other people in optimization who may have had the motive that they had a new method that they wanted to be better than the method we had, so they wanted to run our code so that they could show that theirs is better. People in science and engineering who have optimization problems to solve constantly. And people in other applications like business. Linear programming is very important in business. But sometimes in business, the problems are not linear. So they would say, it would be wonderful if we had a code that could solve nonlinear problems with linear constraints or whatever. So there's a huge market for this, and it's also sometimes valuable for teaching. Someone who's trying to teach about this kind of method can have the students run the program and see what happens.
Were there ever cases where the users would feedback to you and then you would end up working with them and perhaps end up collaborating?
We did that a few times. I mean, sometimes people would say, we want to solve this optimization problem and we don't know how, and are you willing to be a consultant about this problem? And sometimes we were able to do that. Sometimes they would say, we'll pay some money to Stanford if we can get a license to use this code in our products. So let's say a big company wants to have some kind of chemical simulation and they want an optimization routine. And they want to put your routine in their thing. Well, the university has the view that, okay, we should get something back for that. So there are different kinds of relationships. Bell Labs, in its heyday, and I have to tell you, people kept saying to me, you've missed the golden years. You've missed the golden years.
It's always true.
Well, the golden years were before the company was, AT&T was broken up, but I thought it was pretty golden. So it's hard to describe in words, but basically the Computer Science Center, which is what I was part of, and the Math Center, which was basically contiguous in the same building, full of smart people who knew about just about everything. We had no teaching obligations. Our only obligation was to do good research. So I can't tell you how liberating that was. I mean, at Stanford, we'd been on soft money. So every time we wanted to do anything, we had to say which grant will pay for this and can we justify it and so on and so forth. At Bell Labs, the view then was, you work for us, we pay for you. You want to go to a conference? Fine. Want to have a visitor? Fine. I don't know how they did it. I think it's because the research group kept producing such good things that it was easy to justify the expense. Besides, the computing and math centers were cheap compared to the physics and chemistry centers, which needed big labs. But everyone I know who was there says it's the closest thing to paradise that you can imagine. You could come to work when you felt like it. I mean, it was amazing.
Dennis
And
Ritchie was there, I guess, then?
so in the computer science group, we had Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie, who invented Unix, and Dennis invented C. We had Brian Kernighan, famous guy. We had other people who had done other famous things, Rob Pike. We had Bjorn Stroustrup, that's C++. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I was in shock the first week that I was there. So I sort of met Ken Thompson. I thought, this is Ken Thompson. This is Ken Thompson. He's just a regular person sitting around working.
But you had been with George Danson before, so.
I know, but it was just amazing. It was an amazing experience, and I made a lot of friends, and we used to stand in the halls having lively discussions, and if you had a point you wanted to talk about, you could just wander down and find the person, and they didn't say, I have to teach, I have to meet students, I have to do this, I have to do, no committees. You know, so it was great.
And how did you like being on the East Coast?
It took a while to get used to it, so it was different.
Maybe going back to Bell Labs, tell us more about your time there.
It was essentially the best environment I can think of. My colleagues were wonderful. It was so stimulating. I mean, you came over to visit a few times with David Gay and me, and it was a lot of fun. And I would tell people about it, and they'd say, it doesn't sound like you're working very hard. It sounds like you're just having a good time. And I'd say, well, I am having a good time, but I'm working very hard. And, you know, sometimes thinking about the way the world has gone since then, it's considered a loss by many people that there are no labs like that which are basically devoted to research. The problem is that when AT&T was a monopoly, every phone call anyone made in the whole US, part of it supported Bell Labs. And the monopoly made plenty of money. even after the breakup of AT&T in the early 80s, it was still, they could still afford to do it. But I think since then, we know companies have become lean and mean and small, and they don't want to spend the money on people doing research that may not lead anywhere. If something's research and it's going to lead somewhere, in some sense it's not real research because you know what's going to do. But I think that things were gradually changing then, and I think it's sad that you can't do that anymore. Recently there was an event at Bell Labs honoring Dennis Ritchie, who had co-invented Unix and C, and he died last year, and it was a series of talks by people about what he had done and his world and how it had changed the world. And a big message was, it's not like this now. It's not like this now. And I don't know if there's any going back to it. Same with the NPL, by the way, in England. When I went there and you were there, it was pretty much free and open. People could work on what they wanted to. They got lots done. But they weren't producing a profit. They weren't producing revenue. They weren't doing these other things.
Well, do you think it might be like that now in different places, say Microsoft Research or Google?
It might be, but I've heard that it's not really the same. I don't know enough about them to know. Certainly among my colleagues from Bell Labs, we all talk about Bell Labs nostalgia and how we get together and talk about it, and then someone will say, I think we're being unrealistic. It wasn't really that great. And the rest of us will say, yes, it was. Yes, it was.
Well, so eventually you became the head of the scientific computing department or division,
Right.
or?
In research at Bell Labs, the departments were very small, maybe 6 or 7 people. I was asked if I would consider being the department head. I didn't really want to do that. I didn't really want to be in management.
Was that because Bill Corrin left?
Bill Corrin was being promoted,
Oh, yeah.
and I didn't really want to do it. However, Bill, the world's greatest scientific manager, said to me, if you will try it for 3 years and you don't want to continue, that's fine. But I think it would be good if you did it, etc. So I said, all right, I'll do it. And I did it for 3 years, and it was okay, but dealing with people is hard. Dealing with people is hard.
Well, you had much bigger challenges in that direction a little later, I think.
Yes, well, that's right.
So then we came calling.
Yes, then Dave McLaughlin phoned me and said, would I be interested in being chair of computer science at Courant? And I said, I don't want to be chair. I don't want to be
I don't
chair.
know if you know the background on that. Dave and Marcia Berger and I were sitting in his office trying to think, who can we recruit to be department chair?
Okay.
And I said, well, what about Margaret Wright? No, of course she won't be interested. And I was all ready to move on. And Marcia said, wait a minute, that's a good idea. And then we started talking about it, and then Dave called you. And so then what? So then you said no, and he said yes, and then what happened?
Well, it's one of those things where it's hard afterwards to analyze. So I didn't want to be chair because there was a case history where someone else had gone on from Bell Labs to be department chair, and it didn't work out very well. Because, even though I didn't have a lot of power as a department head at Bell Labs, I could still technically fire people. And it was clear often that the way they reacted to me was based on the fact that, I had some control over their life. When you're an academic chair, you don't have a control over people's lives. You can say, would you do this? And I'll just say, no, I'm not going to do it. You know that because you're a chair now. So it was different. And so this had happened to this other person. And so I thought I didn't want to do it. But Dave is a great persuader, Dave McLaughlin. He said, I don't think you should be so quick to be dismissive. He said, why don't you just come in and visit and see what it's like, and we'll talk to you, and so on and so forth. And I was getting worried at that time about what was happening at Bell Labs because it was changing. It had become lucent. We were more focused on working with the businesses on specific projects.
This was in 2000.
2000, 2001. And I was a little nervous about what was happening, as were many people. And I thought, well, it's just a few miles away. Why don't I go in? I have friends there. And I went in, and I thought it was great, and I loved it. And the Courant Institute is so famous, and you were there, and Marcia was there, other people were there.
Peter Lax, Kathleen Morowitz.
And things were not going well at Bell Labs. So the atmosphere was changing. So I thought, maybe I should do this. And I did.
And we were very grateful.
Well,
I suppose the first thing that happened when you arrived to New York, or perhaps even before you arrived, was 9/11.
I was not yet really moved in. This was
Right.
September 2001.
I was worried. I remember that you might think twice
Right.
about it.
And of course, it was so terrible. I mean, just the whole horror. It didn't occur to me not to go into New York, actually.
Had you already accepted the position? by then?
I had already accepted it, and I didn't think, and I was right, that there would be constant terrorist attacks on New York. I was just more worried about the whole future of the country and what's going to happen. People said, well, in New York it's more vulnerable to that because there are more people, and that's true compared to suburban New Jersey, but I didn't really think anyone was safe. And I had wanted all along to teach, and I had liked the idea of being in academia. Bell Labs, in some sense, was more academic than academia. And I thought I should, try the Quran.
But ironically, you didn't teach at first anyway.
I know.
Because you were
Dave
doing
told
administration.
Dave told me not to. Dave said, I think you should not teach at first because he said it's a lot of work being department
Which
chair.
it was. 7 years, I guess, you were department chair plus 1 year on leave, I think.
Right, exactly. Well, we hired some wonderful people. It was a good effort.
Yeah.
Hiring at Bell Labs was more hierarchical. I mean, the department heads tended to sort of decide. They would ask people, what do you think of this candidate? But the decision was really made by the department head. At Quran, it's really, the chair does not have sole responsibility for doing it. So it's much more democratic, which calls on a different set of skills to make sure that everybody agrees as much as possible about that. The other thing that was good, I thought, was having a very broad view of computer science. I got that somewhat at Bell Labs because we were in a computer science center. So we would have what was called the show and tell every week, which I loved. I wish we could do that at Quran, where every week, everyone in the center had to get up and give an informal talk about what he or she was doing. And that was really good, and everybody went to it, and you could sort of learn what your colleagues were doing. We don't have anything like that. I think people are too busy. I think people I think that would not work unless it were a tradition, which it isn't. And then getting the PhD students. The students are very exciting, and they're doing good work, and meeting them and kind of the next generation and what's happening. That's very exciting as well.
Now that you are no longer department chair, you're finally getting to teach. And
Right.
so how do you like that?
It's always interesting to teach material that in theory you should know, because I've taught optimization and I've taught numerical and scientific computing, which are my research areas. So people that don't know me say, well, can't you just lecture about that in your sleep? Why do you need to prepare? Because I'll say I have to prepare my class. And they'll say, why do you have to prepare? And I don't know why. If it's because I'm crazy or something, but I read what I talked about before and I think, oh, I forgot this, or I want to present it a different way, or I want to do something like that. And I end up redoing the whole thing. And of course, the students, I think, don't have any idea that that's taking any work. They may just think you show up and lecture. And maybe some people do, but I'm not like that. So I'm always fussing and worrying and so on and so forth. And I don't like to give the same homework problems twice, so I'm always thinking of how can I do new homework problems? And then I want to do the homework problems myself. And I often discover things that are kind of interesting, often to do with the numerical issues. I'll say, oh, this is funny. Why is this doing this? So I find it intriguing, even in the most elementary classes. And NYU undergraduates are very good. It's hard to get into NYU as an undergraduate. And the students who were the tops in my undergraduate courses are just fantastically good. And it's great to work with them. It's good to work with other students too, but the ones that are really interested and very enthusiastic bring a great joy. So I like that too.
It's too bad we don't have more girls or young women in these classes.
Yes, well,
do you want to say something about this issue? It probably hasn't. What was the percentage of your class at Stanford that was
that were female?
Yeah, say as among the math majors.
You mean as an undergraduate?
Yeah.
Almost none. Almost none. I had classes where there would be 150 men and me. It's better now.
And then when you were a PhD student?
When I was a PhD student, I'd say it was about 20%, which is probably what
Not much,
it is.
but that's about the same as now.
I know. It wasn't that different.
Mm-hmm. Which is shocking, right?
It is shocking. And
Do you have a theory as to why?
Oh, there are lots of theories about it, and the NSF has spent millions trying to find out. When I talk to people one-on-one, which is not scientific, okay, I just talk to young women and I'll say, why aren't you going into computer science, or why aren't you pursuing computer science? Now, this is computer science, not math, okay? And a lot of them say it's the sociology of the field. You know, that it's not friendly to women, that when you see well-known computer scientists, they're not women. There was a meeting that I was involved in the program committee for, and they were talking about getting well-known computer scientists to come, and every one of them, I don't want to be too unfair here, but could be described as a quintessential nerdy male. And someone said, and you wonder why women don't want to go in this field? You know, so I think it's hard. I think it's very hard for them, and especially now women have a lot of choices. So if you're a woman undergraduate who's very good in math and science, you can go into biology, you can go into chemistry, you can go into physics, you can go to neuroscience, you can go into other areas that for some reason seem more appealing.
Do you think it might be partly because computer science is not a real subject in high school, and so girls don't get exposed to it then? And it's more a volunteer, clubby sort of thing?
I don't know. I'm not familiar enough with how undergraduates get into computer science. I know some of our undergraduates come and they've been programming for years. They started when they were 10 with computer games. And I think girls do not, and I'm using the term to mean people 17 or younger, do not play computer games as much. So there's sort of a movement that says we should make computer games about dressing Barbie. Well, you know, that I tend to think, oh, I never liked Barbie. Why would we do that? But if that would help, maybe that would be a good idea.
Do you think it's different in math? I'm not sure what the statistics are, but you may know whether there's much stronger representation of young women and girls in math than there is in computer science.
I think if you look at the overall data for percentage of women undergraduates and so on, it's not so bad. It's not as bad as computer science. The difference comes when you look at who's at the top schools. This is now how many are in the PhD programs at top schools, how many are faculty at the top schools. Right. And I don't have the data at my fingertips, but I think that's sort of the difference. There's a gradual falling off each place. And it's a real problem that I don't think is easy to solve.
So going back to your career, you've told us about Stanford and Bell Labs and NYU, and that's all makes up for a fantastic career. But in fact, you've done many more things outside of these places. So perhaps you can tell us about something about that, about your, especially you became president of SIAM, and perhaps what led up to that, and some of your other experiences serving on national committees and international committees and so forth. Also, you were elected to the National Academy. That's a whole lot.
So I've already told you that I was part of the self-generated student committee at Stanford, because maybe it's dating back to when I was at Sylvania and felt I had no power over anything. Not that I want power, but just to sort of have something to say about it. So it's kind of a funny story. So I was asked to be on a review of a Navy program in applied math. This is when I was still a research associate at Stanford. I suspect that someone said we'd better have a woman on this committee. I mean, we have to be blunt about this. It does matter. So I went to this committee, and I was the only female. And we sat and we heard presentations about what the Navy was doing in different areas. They were quite interesting. And then the chair said to the different panelists, he said, so can each of you kind of summarize what you'd seen? Now, remember, I'd never been on a committee. I didn't know anything about it. But Werner Reinbold, a brilliant mathematician who's co-author of a wonderful book, he was the first person that was asked. And he gave a masterful summary about, well, we've heard about this, and we've heard about that, and we've done this and that. But he didn't have a lot of detailed content. I mean, I was listening very carefully because I thought, this will give me an idea of what to do. And as he talked, I thought, I could do that. I could do that. So when it got to me, I kind of imitated what he had done, put putting in different things, of course. And afterwards I said, Werner, thank you for showing me what to do. And so I realized after a while that when you're on those committees, you listen very carefully, you try to synthesize, and that's what they want. They want your overall view of it. And also not to be disruptive and not to be too critical and not to fall asleep while they're presenting, which happened to one of the committee members. And so I think after I had done that, then someone said, oh, she was on this committee, maybe we could get her to review this thing. And surprisingly, being on those committees, you do have some say about things. They're deciding about things. And also you meet interesting people who don't work in your area. In our careers, we tend to go to meetings where people that are working in the same or similar areas go. But this is a way to meet people that are completely different areas. Completely different areas. And so it just one thing led to another, and I got invited to be on different committees and so on and so forth. As for SIAM, Society for Industrial and Applied Math, Jean Golub forced all of the PhD students to join SIAM, and I joined SIAM, and I went to SIAM meetings, and I liked it a lot. And I was asked, I don't know why, to run for SIAM Council, which I did, and I won, somewhat to my surprise. And then they wanted someone to run for vice president. And I was asked to do this, and the person that asked me said, you're the sacrificial lamb. He said, this other guy is very well known, and he's going to win, but we have to have two candidates, because SIAM has two candidates. And I thought, should I refuse to do this? I mean, it's not a very flattering statement, you know, you're the sacrificial lamb.
This was for vice president?
For vice president. And I thought, oh, why not? You know, if I lose, which he says I'm going to do, it's not a big deal. You don't have to do anything really to run. You have to just put a statement in. But I won. I won, to everyone's complete surprise. So then I was vice president of SIAM, and I got more attention, and I gave some talks, and I did this and that. And then when they came to president and asked me to run, a number of people said, you don't have a chance. You know, this other person's much better known than you are, more senior. We have to have two candidates. And I wasn't expecting to win. I just thought, okay, again, it's an honor to be asked. And again, much to my surprise, I won. So how did it happen? I don't know, but it happened.
So how was it being first vice president and then president? What did you focus on?
I think SIAM is a great organization, and it has many things. And when I ran for president, I actually had to make a statement, somewhat like a platform. You know, I'm going to work on this, I'm going to work on that. So I felt at that time, this would be 94, I think, when I ran, that SIAM should have a better international presence, because we were seen as a U.S. society, but there were lots of members in other countries. And I also thought we should be doing more for women and minorities. I thought we were not sufficiently, as a society, welcoming to groups that were traditionally underrepresented. So those are the things I said we should do. And the usual, keep our journals at blah, blah, blah. So I didn't think those would be very popular issues either. But when I was president, those are two things that I worked on, plus having a community lecture at SIAM meetings, because I thought we should have more outreach to the community.
And were you satisfied with what you managed to do?
Yeah, it was great. I mean, especially we started the UK SIAM section. Mm-hmm. We had other sections that wanted to form in other countries, which I thought was great. The minority and women thing, I was very happy that the AWM became more, Association for Women in Math, became more involved in SIAM meetings. And Diversity Day, which we called it, was something that we did. So I'll just say a comment about that. There were two views. One was that all the math organizations should get together and as a group have activities that supported minorities. I had talked a lot to Richard Tapia, who's very active in that way. And I said, Richard, what if SIAM just did something for SIAM? What if we did something small? Small and cheap. So you want to sell it to the board, you don't want to say we need $50,000, you say we need $5,000. And people are willing to help, and companies were willing to donate money to have that happen. And we had it in Charlotte, North Carolina. There were some minority institutions nearby. I personally called all the chairs of the departments and said, we're having this event. Can you send your best students? They were thrilled. They came. I mean, I loved it. I thought it was great. And, you know, it didn't need all the societies and a big activity. So sometimes in things I've done, this is true for women as well, I've said, let's just have a small thing that we do. It's not going to change the world, but it will make a difference to a few people. And it will set the tone. So I think now at SIAM meetings, there's a much larger visible percentage of women and minorities. They feel welcome. They've been shown that the society cares about them. And to me, that's very important.
What about some of your other service, let's say within this country, for example, Department of Energy?
Once you get on the committee list of people who are willing to do it, reasonable, somewhat broad-minded, etc., and there's always a fine line, because I'm not, I don't think, the doormat type. I mean, sometimes people want on a committee someone who will just agree with whoever's running the program. I'm not like that. Okay, but I don't think, I could be wrong, that I'm seen as disruptive and difficult and causing a lot of trouble. So it's kind of, they'll say, well, we'll get her because, you know, people know she has a mind of her own, but not too much a mind of her own or something. So I was asked to be on the advisory committee for the Office of Advanced Scientific Computing Research. So I chaired that committee for a while. I was chair of the advisory committee for the Math and Physical Sciences Directorate at NSF. And those were always interesting, and I find it fascinating to learn about how different groups function. You know, when you're in math or computer science, you tend to think everybody else is like you, but it's not. They're not like you. So you have to learn about these different cultures and so on and so forth. And then once you start doing that, you get invited by other countries. So I was on a review of Canadian math, which was extremely interesting. Canada has a very different system of funding. And some of the issues that came up would simply not arise in the US. But it was, again, a good group, and Jean-Pierre Bourguignon was the chair of it, and I learned a lot. So every time you learn something. And in 2010, there was a review of UK math research, which I chaired. That was a great experience, and it was really nice to be able to invite people to serve on that, whom I had met on other committees who are in areas completely different from mine. But I know they're very good, they're respected, they're sensible, they're not doormats. You know, you have a long list of qualities that you want. So I actually enjoyed that. I mean, sometimes people say, how can you stand that? And I think it's sort of interesting to hear this. Not if it took 2 weeks, but 3 days.
But some of these things were a lot of work, though.
They were a lot of work. That's right. That's right. But, you know, is it worthwhile?
Yeah. Well, that's the other reason you're invited, because people know they can count on you to do the work that has to be done and prepare reports and so forth.
Right. I knew a woman who used to say, I'm not going to be on a committee unless it personally benefits me. And I said, you know, you may be ruling yourself out of something good because it may not be obvious how it will benefit you. I was trying to persuade her to do something, and she said, no, if I don't benefit, I'm not doing it. I think that's hurt her. I think that's hurt her. I think people say, well, we can't ask her because she won't do it because of whatever. So I've never been on a committee that I thought was a total waste. Some are much more interesting than others. So that's my story about committees.
Well, MSRI is another one.
Well, that was a funny thing. So Bill Thurston called me, Math Sciences Research Institute at Berkeley, which had before that been known as basically a pure math institute. Now, I hate the terms pure math and applied math. I try never to use them, but I'm making an exception here. So it was known primarily as a pure math institute, okay? So Bill Thurston, who was the director, phoned me and said, would you like to be on the scientific advisory committee at MSRI? I said, I think you have the wrong person. Well, because I thought I'm not a pure math person. He said, no, we're trying to get a broader committee. I said, oh, okay. I'll do it. And then I was on the MSRI Scientific Advisory Committee, and then Thurston stepped down as director and David Eisenbud became director. And the MSRI Scientific Advisory Committee was really a great experience. I learned so much about other areas of math. And the other thing you get, again, I don't want to sound too obnoxious here, but you get let's say you're trying to decide which postdocs to invite and they have letters of recommendation. You can almost get some skill about reading a letter of recommendation even if you don't know the area, based on the words people use to describe it. How they describe it, the excitement they have, the enthusiasm they have, and so on. So that was very interesting. In fact, fascinating. And I enjoyed it very much.
And I think you were also involved on something in the Research Triangle, North Carolina?
The SAMC, right, for applied math and statistics. Yeah, so I was on that advisory committee. And again, I don't want to be a Pollyanna here. I mean, it wasn't always wonderful to be on these committees, but I think on balance, I learned a lot. Plus, you see how different organizations function, okay? The MSRI Scientific Advisory Committee was heavily involved in picking the programs and the postdocs. At SAMC, less so. So I could kind of compare the way I thought the programs turned out and how useful the Scientific Advisory Committee was and so on and so forth, which you would never know from the outside if you weren't part of that.
And you're also on the board of Matheon in Berlin?
Oh yes, that's been great. So Matheon is an institute, sort of an institute of 5 universities and institutes from Berlin. Berlin, which is a state in Germany. And they invited me to be on their scientific advisory committee when they started. So they got a big grant from the equivalent of the NSF. And the idea was to use math in technologies. So it was a lot of very good math, but they had to have sort of applications in mind. And they did a very good job of dividing up the people. Martin Gritschel is heavily involved in that, and Rolf Mehring. And they wanted some advice on how to do it. So the Scientific Advisory Committee has people mostly from Europe, but a couple of Americans. And we get to hear what they're doing, and there was a re-competition, and they got more money. And it's been very exciting to see how they're doing this, keeping the quality of the research high, but also producing things that are useful. And I think they have an amazing record in doing that. So that's been great.
We shouldn't forget to talk about the National Academy. You're one of the few people who has been elected to both the National Academy of Science and Engineering. What's that experience been like?
Courant has 3 such people. I don't know, Leslie, Marcia, and me. I don't know what the number is, the total number, but it's not.
And Jim Demmel, I guess, is another one at Berkeley.
That's
Is
right.
that right?
Yes. So I was in the National Academy of Engineering first. And scientific computing is an area that many people feel doesn't have a home, and we bemoan the fact that, are we in math? Are we in computer science? What are we, etc. But in the academies, it's a good position to be in because scientific computing, depending on how you do it, fits into computer science and engineering in the National Academy of Engineering. So there are people there who write numerical software. Cleve Moeller is a member, Bob Bixby is a member, et cetera, et cetera. And somehow I was elected to that. And then I was on the peer committee, which picks the people for the ballot, and I chaired the committee on membership. And then, I don't know how, I was elected to the National Academy of Sciences, but it's the same thing. I think what we do is something that fits well into the applied math section in the National Academy of Sciences. So, some other people, it's not clear if they fit in, quote, math or applied math. What we do fits clearly into applied math. So that's another thing. And I was chair of the applied math section for 3 years, and that was very interesting as well.
What did that involve?
Organizing the elections and trying to make sure that people got nominated. I mean, it's an example where I think it's better for the section to have many good candidates And some people just say, oh, it's too much work to nominate somebody. It's not that much work to nominate somebody. So I would kind of say, I'll help you with the nomination and I'll try to get more people in. Because in the National Academy of Engineering, for example, for when I was really the most active there, the number of slots allocated to each section, it's 12 sections, depended on how many nominations you got. And our section, the computer science section, had tended to have people who would only nominate the people they thought would definitely get in. So they had a very small number of nominations, and some of us, Dave Patterson was one, Bob Sproul and I, said, let's nominate people we think are really good, you know, and maybe they won't get in, but maybe they will, and this will help us, you know, get more momentum and so on and so forth. And I think that was very helpful because we became more present and we got more nominations and we got more people, and I think it's been quite successful.
So another role for the National Academy is that maybe the main role is advising the government and the
Right.
president.
Right.
Were you involved in that?
Well, it's interesting because the National Academy is asked to write reports about things, and so they're trying all the time to write these reports, and they try to get people who are members of the academies to serve on the reports. And a difficulty with the reports is so much time is needed to gather information. There's a very heavy responsibility on the National Academy because their reports are considered the gold standard. So maybe they could ask you a question and you'd just give some answer. If you were the National Academy, you'd have to conduct an intense year of research and get evidence and get witnesses and do this and that. So I think a problem that the National Academies face is they're kind of expensive. So a funding agency has to pay them to do these reports.
Is there a staff that helps
There's
with
a
that?
staff.
A big staff? Or?
I think it's reasonably big. I'm not absolutely sure about that. But some people are concerned about it because I think funding agencies, for example, I think the NSF used to provide core funding for one of the groups at the National Academy in mathematics. They don't do that so much now because they have other things to spend the money on. So I think it's a very important function of the Academy, but I think it's a worry that it's not used enough. So I don't know the answer to that. I'm not involved in the leadership of the Academy, so I don't know.
Another thing is that SIAM gave you this wonderful award, Distinguished Service to the Profession.
Right.
I'm sure recognizing probably all of these things.
I actually have, I'm wearing my obnoxious hat now, the AMS Award for Public Service and the SIAM one. So why am I getting these awards? Why did I get them? Well, I think it's because of the committee service. I've tried to be helpful to different groups. And I think it's because of the activities with women and minorities, which have been, you know, I've done a lot of that, and I've tried really hard to work on that. And I think that's considered to be an important aspect. It's not always popular. I mean, you know, there are people that say the job of the societies is to promote math research, period, end of story. Not think about the community and not think about the future. And I think not everybody thinks that, but I think there's some pressure in that direction. So people that spend their time on, you know, let's get more women students to come, that might not be seen as so important.
Well, speaking of women, you also gave the Emmy Noether lecture.
I did.
And that was, what was that recognizing exactly?
It's from the AWM. They have one every year, and I gave it at the joint math meeting, which takes place in January.
What did you talk about?
I talked about non-derivative optimization, and I used quotes from Jane Austen in my talk, yes, such as he had something to direct his search. It's about direct search methods. So giving those overview talks is something I do it. It's an enormous amount of work because one never wants to reuse the same talk twice. But, you know, for groups like high school kids or undergrads, I gave a talk at Washington last fall called Math Across Campus. University of Washington, yeah. Math Across Campus, which is for undergrads in mathematics. And I talked about linear programming and what I've just said earlier about the complexity and so on and so forth. And, you know, it was a lot of work to prepare that. I actually enjoyed it, and I think students were interested. it's not something they normally learn in that way.
So, Margaret, one thing we haven't talked about is your editorial work, which you've done a great deal, I think, particularly for SIAM journals, and in particular, you reorganized SIAM Review. Perhaps you could tell us something about about all that.
One of the things I'm very interested in is exposition. So having co-written 2 books and papers, I care a lot about clear explanations and so on. So I've been editors of journals for SIAM and for the Mathematical Programming Society. And that's another thing that's very time consuming, but I think it's worthwhile because the quality of those journals is a direct reflection of the quality of the research that the society is interested in, and I think it's important, especially for SIAM because I was so heavily involved in that. So I've been an editor of the SIAM Journal on Scientific Computing and the SIAM Journal on Optimization, and the flagship journal of SIAM, SIAM Review, was a journal that had been around for a long, long time since the society started in '52. And at some point, it was decided that it needed to be looked at. There were sections of it that had been really important that were not felt to be so important, and there was a concern that it wasn't a very good flagship journal. Okay, so there was a committee that was put in charge of looking at SIAM Review and deciding what to do about it. They're the ones that really did the main work and said, we should redo this section, we should redo that. Now, there are a lot of things which are sort of redoing for its own sake. You know, people say we need a fresh start, and sometimes it's not very good, and sometimes you hate it. Every time I get a notice that says we've redone our website, I usually groan and I think, oh no, I have to look at this new website. But in the case of SIAM Review, I think it was important. So I was asked to be the editor-in-chief of the new SIAM Review. And I felt it was essential because there were separate sections, this review and survey part, the new stuff, the education section. I thought it was absolutely essential to have section editors who would basically be responsible for those sections. I think it's fine to have top-down management in some areas, but in this case, I wanted absolutely top people to do this, and they wouldn't have agreed if I was sort of going to be in control. So I invited people that I thought were terrific to do that, and I said, basically, this is the charge of the new section. Let's talk about how you would do it. You can sort of run it. And they all agreed to do it. And I think that was very successful. And the journal had a new cover. I confess I had something to do with the colors and so on the cover. But basically, it was the section editors that did the most of the work. They would call on me when things came up that there were problems about. But basically, it was an interesting example where I don't take any credit for doing that because I think it was their good work. The only thing I can take credit for is picking them to do it. And I think most people are happy with it. But since then, things have changed. I mean, you can't keep the same format forever. Things change. The online publishing, websites, and so on have made a big difference in publication. And so I'm happy SIAM Review is still highly cited and still regarded as good.
Have you taken much interest in this new all-electronic journal that SIAM has?
Not so much. I mean, I was chair of the publications committee, the journals committee, and we considered the options of having an all-electronic journal. And I think for some areas, like dynamical systems, where there's a huge emphasis on animations and visualization and active things, which you just can't do in print, I thought it was very important to do that.
And that's been successful,
And that's been very successful. But again, it's really the people. It's the top quality editorial board to do it. SIAM has had a tradition of not having dictatorial editors-in-chief. I think some other journals, the editor-in-chief is kind of the super boss and tells everybody what to do. That can be okay if the person is exceptional, but I think often they have a hard time finding other people to work with them for obvious reasons. And SIAM tries very hard not to do that.
So you've often spoken about the excitement of real-world applications. Maybe you could expand on that a little bit.
I love getting mathematical results. You know, one of the results I liked was the result about the ill conditioning of the Hessian of an interior point method. Okay, so that was good. That was a theoretical result. But what I like the best is when I can do theory and write software and have it solve a real-world problem. That's the best, having all those things. So when I worked at Bell Labs, one of the projects I work on was about indoor wireless. So we were trying to place base stations in a building to get optimal coverage of a wireless system. So we worked as a team. We had a guy that did computational geometry. Had Brian Kernahan, who did user interfaces. David Gay and I worked on the optimization. We had wireless engineers. A great experience because we all liked each other. No one was trying to take over, and we each had different expertise. So when I was working on that problem, which was very important to the company, I became interested in optimizing without derivatives. And I had not been interested in that before, and I learned what was going on, and I thought, you know, there's some room here for some work that would be interesting on these methods. So we did some software which became used by the company, so engineers would use it to design wireless systems. I got interested in the Nelder-Mead method for unconstrained optimization, which I'm still interested in, which is a puzzle and a mystery because it works well a lot of the time, but you can show it can fail miserably. So why is that? What's going on? There's no mathematical explanation for that yet. And it's very exciting when you go into a building and there's a wireless system to think, I helped optimize this. Okay, so to me, that's the best. When I was at Stanford, we worked with some people from SLAC, the linear accelerator, who wanted to improve the time that it took to turn the accelerator back on. So they had a system where it was off half the year and on half the year. And when they turned it back on, it was never calibrated correctly. Things had always gotten confused during the months of it being off. And they wanted to get it started again. And they had to adjust all these magnets. And they came to us and they said, this person at SLAC that I met, and they said, we'd like to automate this. So we took the code npsol that you've mentioned and made a version called npslack, which solved their problem. It used a simulation of the way the particles were accelerated in the linear accelerator, and it tried to optimize the settings of the magnets automatically using an SQP method. And it worked brilliantly. So they were very happy. The SLAC people were particularly happy because it showed that you could do some simulation rather than having to rely on turning it off, turning it on, turning it off, turning it on. And so when I drive by SLAC, I'm always thrilled. I mean, they're probably not using it anymore. So it depends on, you know, the application. But I think the individual mathematical excitement is more sort of I've solved that puzzle. I've tied this knot. I've done this and that. Getting the code to work is great because you think, yes, it's actually working. And then seeing the real world thing is just very exciting. I think people who work on medical applications may get the greatest thrill there. You know, I've saved somebody's life by doing this.
Although it's also very stressful because they don't want to make mistakes.
No, that's right. I mean, it's not like it's trivial to do this, but it's a very great excitement.
So when you look back over your career, which has spanned several decades, obviously, you've accomplished a great deal. Are there some things that you feel is kind of astounding that you managed to, some areas where you think it's astounding that perhaps we've advanced as much as we have, and other areas where it's perhaps disappointing that we haven't made as many changes that we would have liked to have done?
I think that's a very useful question because it's interesting to go back and look at papers and documents that were written, say, in the 80s. I mean, I got my PhD in '76, but sort of look back and see the progress that we've made. So in optimization, at various points, people have said, well, for nonlinear problems, you can solve problems with hundreds of variables. Of course, that's a very imprecise statement. They never say what kind of problems or whatever. Today, we had a talk where the person was talking about hundreds of thousands or millions of variables. That's an amazing change. It's an amazing change in capability. And it's not all due to computer hardware. I think sometimes people think, oh, machines are faster, machines are bigger. But it's smarter and better algorithms, which is the area that you and I work in, right? Not making faster machines. We try to take advantage of them, but we don't make them run faster. And to me, that's astonishing. And the great part of it is, I think, there are still interesting problems that don't have many variables. In this non-derivative optimization area, something that's been fascinating to me is cancer chemotherapy. What's the optimal set of drugs you should take with your kind of cancer for your own needs? That's not very many variables. It's highly nonlinear. You don't have derivatives. How can you do that in an intelligent way? Instead of the doctor saying, well, let's double this one and cut this one in half. Can we be smarter than that? But you have to be really careful. You can't just try it on a lot of patients as you would with a computer simulation. And then there are problems with enormous numbers of variables that are really hard that people want to solve.
And how about if we ask the same question, but not in relation to advances in research, but in relation to advances in society, say the role of women, minorities, other whatever else you might want to mention?
There's no doubt that the situation for women is much better than when I started my career. The kinds of pretty obnoxious comments that were always made to me, you know, like, you only got to do this because you were a woman, or as someone said to me once at Sylvania, do you know what a cosine is? I mean, you know, that kind of comment people don't tend to make now. Now, whether they secretly think it, I don't know. So I think women have advanced a lot, but there's a long way to go. And talking to women students at Currant, I can tell that they're not always getting the encouragement to do things that the male students are. Or they're put off by aspects of the profession, math or computer science, that I don't fully understand. I was taught programming in the days when it was like boot camp. You know, you have to program this. It doesn't have any real-world applications. I love that. I thought it was great. But some women don't like that. So can we do better for them? And I think with math, we don't always do a good job of making clear what useful things math can do. I don't know how many applied math courses start off by saying, here's a real-world application and here's how this got solved, and isn't that exciting? I think personally that would be good, but there are people who feel that's dumbing down and you should, you know, stay rigorous and theoretical. For minorities, I think it's much harder, and there's still a lot of work to be done. And I work closely with some people in the minority community, and I think an issue there is they have more options. You know, a lot of places would really like to encourage minorities to go into science and engineering. That doesn't mean math and computer science. So I think we just have to do a better job there by making it attractive. I mean, there's this sort of funny thing. So sometimes people will ask me about being a woman, and I'll say, well, you know, it wasn't so nice when people would make these pretty nasty comments to me about being a woman and, you know, how you're inferior. And they say, well, that should challenge you. That should make you want to succeed. And it's true that if someone says to you, you're no good, you think, yes, I am. But not everybody reacts that way. Some people say, you say I'm no good, I don't want to be around you. You know, I don't want to be here in this group. So it's not the case that everybody reacts well to criticism. There was a department head at Bell Labs, not in my center, thank God, who used to give the best people bad write-ups. And we would say, why are you doing that? I mean, this guy was a jerk and he didn't stay as a department head very long. And he said, well, I want to challenge them. I want to spur them to do better. And the rest of us said, but it's wrong, it's unfair. Why are you doing this? He said, well, that's the way to get them to perform. I really found that hard to credit.
Margaret, what do you see as the really exciting lines of research in our field, maybe specifically in optimization or more generally in computer science in the coming years?
Well, I consider numerical analysis and scientific computing to be part of both math and computer science. And I think one of the exciting things that keeps happening is new and unexpected mathematical connections are made with practical algorithms. Okay, so lots of people have worked on certain kinds of methods and you can prove results about them. And then they put them in practice and they don't behave the way that you would expect they would from the theory. So if you're a theoretical person, you think, why is that? Why are they not behaving the way that I think they should behave? And you look into that, and sometimes you find these unexpected connections. Other times you have a mystery, why is a method behaving the way that it does? And you find a whole new outlook. I mentioned the simplex method earlier, the Dantzig simplex method, where there's this worst case exponential time example. And for years and years and years, people tried to come up with ways of analyzing its behavior, average case analysis. And then Spielman, Dan Spielman and Xinghua Teng came up with this fantastic thing called smooth analysis, which is a whole different way of looking at complexity, which shows that under certain conditions, the simplex method is a polynomial time algorithm because you perturb it in the right way. That's brilliant, and they've gone on to do more and more things like that. No one expected that. They've opened up a whole new field. So if you have creative people thinking about problems in different ways, and this is where the mathematics comes in, because the background in mathematics that needs to be applied to certain methods is not the one that people in those fields are trained in. And so someone from another field can look at it and say, well, you know, this is this kind of system, or this is this kind of problem. Have you considered such and such? And you say no, and magically it happens. So I think there's a lot of connection that needs to be made. It's widely stated that in mathematics, fields are merging together and that results from one field are being applied in other fields. I think that's true in computer science as well.
Spielman is a very interesting example because, as you know, he was a Courant lecturer last year, just 6 months ago, I think. And what I found very exciting about that was that we had polled, in my role as department chair, I was involved, we had polled the faculty for suggestions, and you had suggested Spielman. But what was interesting is the same suggestion completely independently came from one of the pure mathematicians, might have been Asaf Naor.
Right.
And it seemed to me, once we heard that name suggested from two very different sources, yes, this is the guy. And in fact, he gave a great couple of lectures.
Right, and there's a National Academy report called Mathematical Sciences 2025, which will come out, I hope, before too long. I've been on the committee for that. And a huge message of that is how mathematics is creeping into, or I don't know, running into all these areas that was not important in before, and being used in new ways. And this brings new insights. I mean, I think that's the great thing about what research can do, is you have a way, you look at it a certain way, someone comes in from a different area with a different perspective, and it just opens it up. So many things are like that. And it's something, I mean, the report is going to say, I think it's not out yet, so I can't officially say anything. It's going to talk about trying to take advantage of this and exploit this fact. And so many of the public think, you know, math is high school algebra, and it's all done. And they have no idea that it's living and exploding and doing all these interesting things. And it is. And I think the mathematical sciences community, and I'm going to include the computer science community, has to do that, has to participate in that. We can't leave it to other people. So to me, it's very exciting. It's a very exciting time. Everybody says that, but I actually believe it. And I think we can continue to do a good job in that regard.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.